to Navigating Change, the podcast from Teibel Education. My name is Pete Wright, and I'm thrilled to introduce our guest on the show today. Jeff Shields serves as president and CEO of the National Business Officers Association, and he sat down with Howard on the eve of their annual meeting in San Diego. Their conversation centers on the change in the narrative in independent school education, as so many have adjusted to the new normal, incorporating new models of tuition and financial management. What's more, he introduces Business Intelligence for Independent Schools, BIIS, a tool for NBOA member institutions and business officers to analyze an exhaustive range of financial data and turn it into meaningful information. And now I'll turn it over to Howard with Jeff Shields of NBOA.
It is so great to see you, Jeff. Thank you for coming and being on the show again. This is like SNL. I think you're one of the people that have been on more than you and Mike Gower. Are the two high? You don't remember Mike Gower? Of course you know Mike Gower.
I do from my Nakubo days, and that's good company to be in. So that's terrific. I take that as a compliment. We're the Alec Baldwins of your podcast.
Or Steve Martin. You're either Alec Baldwin
or Steve Martin.
You've got an exciting week ahead of you, both personal and professional, so we can dive into whatever you want. But next week is the annual meeting for NBOA, and we thought we would do a preview conversation. People will likely hear this after we go through this next week. But I want to give you a chance to share what has been happening in your world, really helping business officers in the independent school world navigate the changes and some of the ways that NBOA is serving this constituency. So tell us a little bit about next week and what's going to be happening.
Next week, we are going to be riding the waves of change in San Diego at the 2019 NBOA annual meeting. We are welcoming, as we've been true to form for the last several years, we're going to be welcoming our largest audience to the meeting, which is exciting for us. And we have great speakers lined up. We have Gabby Giffords and Mark Kelly kicking things off, which I just think is really exciting. They have such a powerful story to tell. You know, Gabby Giffords was the former congresswoman that was a victim of gun violence. She happens to be married to an astronaut, you know, not too much of a power couple, right? And obviously gun violence is something that all schools, but pre-K through 12 schools in particular, and certainly independent schools aren't immune from it. It's something that's top of mind. And having a daughter who's 12 years old, almost 13, as you know, and is in the seventh grade. Lockdown drills are her fire drill. You know, is the fire drill of this generation to prepare for a lone shooter scenario. So isn't that sobering to think about that happens every day in schools across our country? So.
And it's been normalized in a certain way, but in the same ways, what you're doing is you're saying we need to find a way to have conversation about this, where even though it's normalized behavior, it's not normal, but we need to engage with this in a thoughtful way with the right attitude and moods.
Yes, that's Gabby Giffords and Mark Kelly kicking things off, and they're not there to make political speeches. What they're really there to talk about is their life story, how they overcome, you know, one of the most horrific circumstances I think any couple could encounter, and they just have an exciting story to tell. And I don't get really kind of gushy and patriotic, but these are two really amazing Americans, and they have such a great story together, and that's what they're going to be talking about: overcoming adversity. You know, against all odds, and they're really going to talk to it from a human level. So very excited about that. But the overall theme, just so you know, is about change. And I'd say that that's something that obviously it's constant. We all experience it. But I think that at this juncture for our schools, I think the change imperative is stronger than ever. So what we're going to try and do with our time together is continue to focus on succeeding, overcoming obstacles in our opening speaker, really talking about what it's like to be a leader, not just to be a highly competent business officer and financial executive, but really being a leader at your school and what that means, and how they can innovate and engage their teams around thinking differently to address the challenges, which are many, but I like to remain optimistic.
What you just described have been conversations out there. For the last 10 years, I've been hearing this kind of focus about change and leadership and how do we move the needle and all of those. But I think what's different is that the nature of what's happening in the world is getting people to pay more attention to that this is not something we can ignore. And in some ways, I'm curious to hear from you, what are you noticing are some of the shifts that are going on that are making this even more relevant topic, where you cannot dismiss it, where you cannot say, we're fine. I think we're at a critical juncture at this point in education where there's so many alternatives that are beginning to pop up. The cost of the education, especially for the K-12 world, you just mentioned it to me before we went live, is talking about the fact you're competing with free. So there's a wake-up call for business officers in your world to take a leadership stance with their heads. Say a little bit about what's shifting for you in the last couple of years that you're seeing that this wake-up call and this, really taking this on in a different way. Is it any different than it was, or is it more the same?
I think it's different because I feel as though the activity is different. I don't think it's dialogue. I don't think it's long strategy sessions. I think that's part of it, but people are doing the work now. People are living with the change they're trying to create, the positive impact they're trying to have. And I see it in a couple ways. I see schools really taking a look at their tuition models and really changing them. And that is not easy work to do. If you think about it, it's your number one revenue stream for your organization. It could comprise maybe 70 or 80% of the dollars that you take in every year. And do you know the level of risk that's involved with that when you start to change that model? But schools are finding they don't have a choice. They don't have a choice. So they're employing index tuition. They're taking a look at ways to avoid sticker shock by being more aggressive with ways to provide additional support, whether it's financial aid, whether it's merit aid. They're taking a look at how can they do a better job of managing to the real cost of what it takes to educate a child at their schools in real dollars, and figuring out ways that their tuition model can better support that, so they don't have to rely so heavily on fundraising and auxiliary services and their endowment, those types of things.
Well, what's interesting is, say a little bit about this BI tool that you guys are promoting in the dashboard and what that is for any of our listeners.
Yes, so BIIS is our shorthand for Business Intelligence for Independent Schools, so BIIS. Now, NBOA has been in the research space for many, many years, but what we've done recently is we've taken disparate research initiatives and we've combined them into a singular platform, utilizing technology, allowing schools the opportunity to enter their data. We scrub it, we review it, and then they can use the data in ways that allow a lot more flexibility than just static reports that we previously issued. So that's the first thing. It's a data technology platform. But what I think is most important is really a shift that NBOA is taking. And while collecting data and benchmarking yourself against either a cohort group or against the entire community of schools can be valuable information, we're really focusing on reporting and analysis and tools that, once you enter your data, can be automated to be delivered to you in your school so you can have those strategic conversations that you need to have. what does that look like? For us, it looks like a financial dashboard. So we distilled down what we think are the 12 key data points that any business officer should be tracking, should be sharing with their leadership team and their board of trustees, and they should be talking about. And for us, a dashboard, and as you know, doesn't answer every question. It raises the right questions, right? And so that's something that's completely automated, really worked hard to distill what are the data points, the fewest number of data points that give the biggest picture of a school's financial health in a snapshot in time. That's one thing. Second thing, and this might be interesting to your higher education listeners, is that the Composite Financial Index, which was developed by Phil Tahey, who was with KPMG, I think I'm going to get that right, with KPMG for 20 years, developed this tool that really helps a school get in under the hood. And we have, with Phil's support and guidance, and a partnership that we developed with the National Association of Independent Schools, and I want to give them a shout out as well, because it's really been the best partnership between NEIS and NBOA since during my tenure, at least, and I'm really appreciative of that. We got together, and so this calculator is built into our platform so that schools can, again, they enter their data on the front end. That's great. Entering data isn't the thing. It's what you're doing with the data on the other side that's the thing. And so they can use this CFI calculator. I would recommend it for more sophisticated schools and more sophisticated boards who've spent some time understanding their finances to a pretty deep level. But these types of tools, that's what we're interested in. The analysis to help solve problems, the analysis to drive decision making, tools and resources that we can deliver to our schools and business officers so that the schools can wrestle with these important questions, and they have the right, hopefully they have the right information to do so.
Beautiful. Who has access to this? If you're a member of NBOA, you can use the tool. Is that how it works?
For right now, I mean, we're serving over 1,400 schools in the United States, independent pre-K through 12 schools. So it is a member benefit at this point in time. But we're relatively new in this space. It's a relatively new offering that we've had. We've invested a lot of time and resources, as you can imagine, in a completely customized data collection platform. But right now, it's primarily, it's only available, I want to be honest, it's only available to member schools. But we're thinking about what access might look like going down the road.
Well, I mean, what you do is you're building it from the ground up. And you're building it with schools that you have relationships with, and then this becomes a way to learn how it can be utilized to promote the kind of strategic conversations that you just said. I mean, this is the piece that I see also in higher ed, is that there's lots of conversation about how we want to be more strategic, but we don't know how to use data properly as a means to augment the conversations, as opposed to people think this, data decision versus data informed. Right? That we're going to be data informed to be able to make decisions, as opposed to the data actually drives the decision. No, you can't do it that way. You're in a space right now that is, that's not only ripe for change, but I think has the opportunity to figure out how you're going to continue to remain relevant. No one wants to talk about survival like that's inspirational, right? Surviving isn't inspirational. At the same time, thinking 10, 20 years down the road, what this industry is going to look like, the independent school world, I'm curious, as you take a longer term horizon, how are we positioning leaders to be thinking around the longer term horizon? Because I'll tell you, one of my concerns, Jeff, is that business leaders, the business heads in independent schools, the cabinets and senior leadership teams, they are still so focused on putting out fires in the next budget cycle. I don't think we have yet found ourselves having a good mechanism to think long term, to take a different kind of horizon, because we don't see how we can affect that. And that's an area that I'm investing much more of my time these days, is helping people think in a longer term horizon and then backing into the short term, not for your strategic plan, but to recognize that when we think longer term, there are disruptions that we can't anticipate, and how do we engage in those conversations? How are you, NBOA and business officers, doing that in this space?
Well, I think the reality is that our market is under tremendous pressure. Schools are under tremendous pressure. The market is arguably stagnant. One could argue is shrinking, incrementally.
In terms of the number of students, you say shrinking in terms of the number of prospective students entering the space.
I would say yes. I would actually couch it as the number of families we're serving, because I do think an independent school education serves families. But I think it's the concern is the number of families that consider independent pre-K through 12 education as a viable option for their son or daughter. That's the concern. That market, people who are even considering it, is not the same market as it was 10 or obviously 20 years ago. Even families that perhaps have the means to afford that education still may not be considering it.
5 years ago, Grant Lichtman and I were speaking together, and I remember him saying, we'd done a podcast with him, and he's been in your space forever, former head of school, traveled around the country in a Volkswagen bus or whatever. And I remember him saying 5 years ago or longer, maybe it was 10, that the public market is 80% as effective. He's beginning to see as our private. So how do we justify the differentiation? So now that was 10 years ago. I'm imagining that he would even say that they are even better today than they were then. So this differentiation is such a critical conversation.
And it's a hard one to get your arms around, Howard, because independent schools, public schools, it's not monolithic, right? It's market to market. It's community to community. So when you say they perform this way or they don't perform in this regard, it's really hard to get your arms around it, particularly as a national organization. But what we do know to be true is that and what I am observing, going back to really the original question, what's happening now around change that's so different, is that our schools are very much more inclined to focus on how do we open that funnel wider? How do we attract families into the process with the means to pay, that are fit with our mission, that can benefit from this education, that understand its unique value. And I think opening up that funnel wider, really, frankly, I have to be honest with you, and I'm an advocate. I'm a paid advocate, in full disclosure.
Yep.
I think that's a good thing for everybody. I think it's good that families understand what's available through this option. I think it's good for families to know that there's support should they choose to make this significant investment for their son or daughter. I think that's a good thing for everybody. It's good for our independent schools. It's good for the families we serve. And I think, I use this reference a lot. When I was first came into this space, I was the youngest of 6 kids. My mom never thought about walking down the street to the private school and said, "Look, I have 6 kids. How can I send them to this school?" It was never up for discussion.
Never an
but
option.
The fact of the matter is, there's more financial support than people believe is true, and that the investment, I think the investment pays dividends that are far greater than what they perceive initially. So,
and why this is so relevant, Jeff, especially for the people that you're serving in your association, is that they have a role to play that is way beyond balancing the budget. But I can tell you, I have worked in this industry long enough to see that the pressure is to balance the budget. The pressure is to make sure that we have enough funds and to minimize expense. And I work with a few business officers who really don't act like business officers, meaning they're advocating for more investment, for more spending, versus the majority of them advocate for less spending, and because they see it as a risk in the short term. And it seems to me that one of the things that's so critical for your audience that you're serving is how do you help them sort of broaden their sense of identity beyond the managers of the money. And I think this is we're still stuck in a very short-term thinking, and we have to keep putting that pressure to have that role be elevated. The head doesn't have the answer. The business officer has so much more data, but they need to use it in a way to promote change. People have to step up into that conversation.
I absolutely do, and I believe they have. I think the environmental factors, and I know I go back to this a lot, but I still think one of the tipping points for business officers in independent schools was the economic downturn in 2008 and 2009, where schools that were thriving in every way imaginable got caught flat-footed in what was happening in the environment. Heads of schools realized they didn't know enough about their own organization's business model as much as they should have or could have, and trustees demanded that heads of schools and business officers have got to work more closely together so this doesn't catch us off guard again. I think that was a tipping point for independent school business officers in this profession, and for NBOA, frankly. Because NBOA, at that time, for the last 10 years, we've seen tremendous growth in organization participation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's been this synergy around environmental factors, demand from school leadership, and NBOA, pedaling as fast as we can to fulfill those needs. So I think that was the game changer. And I think now we're in a new one. I think the role of the business officer has been elevated. I think for the last 10 years, I think heads of schools and business officers, and I think schools that have been successful navigating the impact of the 2009 economic downturn, I think they realized it was a partnership. I think they realized that business officers were far more than just the accounting, finance, and tax managers for the school. I think they did realize the acumen they had around data, and that could be helpful. Business officers have long had the most exposure to governance.
I agree, but that's different from being empowered to step into being that kind of leader. I've talked to enough business officers that one of the dilemmas they have is how far can they step out in front of their head, right? How much are they able to actually be a driver of change also in collaborating with their senior team, where everyone on the senior team has a different view of what change looks like. So I think a lot of this has to do with learning how to be in conversation with each other and to drive a shared conversation about where you want to go. And I don't think that's as easy. I know it's not as easy as it looks, even with your own senior team. Getting everybody to rowing in the same direction. That to me is the critical next step, is how do we effectively coordinate together in a way that we've never been in the past?
Well, let me say two things about that. The first thing is that, number one, I would never advocate, and I know you didn't mean this, but I would never advocate for business officers to step out ahead of or in front of heads of schools, because that's how you lose your job.
Exactly. But let me clarify what I meant. I think there's a concern that there's a reticence to take something on because of the fear of stepping out ahead, right?
Perception, yeah.
You really have to know your head well enough and have the kind of trust that you can actually give yourself permission to push the envelope, to try new things, because I think this is what most heads want. They want, and I think a lot of what you're I think advocating for is how do we empower these leaders, especially if you're new at a school, right? If you're a new business officer at a school, you're likely going to take your first year to learn the ropes of the relationships, and you've got this window that you got to put something in place. So I think there's an opportunity to raise, and raising the bar means something different for everybody. But in general, what I've seen, Jeff, over the years, the shift that's happening is a greater awareness, but that needs to translate into from awareness to new behavior. And the new behavior is like undoing a certain kind of behavior that we've fallen into, which is often waiting to be told and get permission and the board feeling good about it, right? I think that there's an element of learning how to take calculated risk and risk and fear of failure, right? Being willing to actually face the risk of failure. That's part of the conversation, and I'm sure it's going to come out at the annual meeting. That will be part of the dialogue that you're trying to help people engage in.
Well, that was my point around the tuition models and taking your highest revenue stream and you start tinkering with it. Now, if that doesn't take a team effort and trust, I don't know what else does, and that's what's happening. So I would say
awesome.
maybe is it 100% no? But we'll keep pushing in that direction. But I will share an observation that the schools that are getting in front of change, that are harnessing actually better than getting in front, that are creating the change they want to see happen, are able to do so because they have strong partnership between the head of school, the business officer, other key members of the school leadership team,
Absolutely.
and their board of trustees, and they're discussing the right things in the right way, and they're moving forward. And
then there's the other side, which is those that haven't been leveraging that, right? What do you think are some of the impediments for the schools that are not leveraging being able to create that kind of leadership partnership, engaging their teachers and their principals and so on, and starting to move the needle in the change conversation? Where do you see the impediments showing up there?
Well, I think you named one. I think fear. I think, when you're dealing with a large population, many of whom have been doing this work for a long time and they've been successful, you know what that looks like. And you go into the room and you say, today we're going to talk about how we're going to change or how we're going to innovate. And they just see it as more work. And in some respects, they see it as,
right,
more work. And I'm not sure the outcomes. There's the fear. And moreover, I don't have time. I'm already giving everything I have. And then I would punctuate it with, and where are the resources, and time is a resource, but where are the financial resources to do or think or perform differently? So those are real constraints.
Right. And that's where the business officer, people often say that they don't have enough resources or enough people, right? I think that's an excuse, because the truth is, often you put more people in place, you have more problems because you have more challenges associated with coordination. That's what I'm seeing more as the impediment to acceleration, is not that we don't have good ideas, but we don't know how to be in conversation with each other that then produces the coordination conversation. But there's competencies in that teams don't even have, that they need to practice. It's interesting because when I ask you the question about who's not doing it, in many ways, you're often speaking to the choir. The people that show up at your annual meeting are people who have bought into the idea that we need to change. Right? So that's the good news. The thing I
think about that a lot, Howard. I do think about that. Does someone in my role, do I only get exposed, or do people only come up and share, and they only seek me out because they think they have something hot and new to share? And so then that starts to color my perception about what's happening in the community. But we do have we did just pull some data from BIIS, and we have some good themes that we've seen over the 2017-18 data that are worth keeping an eye on and looking at, whether it's net tuition revenue going up, increased fundraising, or more expendable financial resources for schools to do some of the things you're talking about.
And and when I hear you say to give those examples, the relevance for me of those examples has more to do with creating a certain kind of optimism and a certain kind of positivity, right? So that people, because the alternative, Jeff, and this is out there that you and I are always fighting against, is the resignation and skepticism that people fall into. And then they put their head down, they do their best job, but really they don't see that the change really is possible. So much of this is getting people out of a mood of, I don't think this could happen, to a mood of, maybe we can make this happen.
Howard, I was invited to speak at the Virginia Association of Independent Schools Heads Conference just a few weeks ago. And boy, they gave me more than I could ever give them, because the theme of their meeting was leading with optimism. And I was their first speaker that morning. And they said, we don't want to talk about the doom and gloom scenarios. We don't want to talk about the pressures. We don't want to talk about the problems. We want to talk about how can we, and these are heads of schools, how can we lead with optimism, how can we harness positivity? How can we communicate a vision that's compelling and exciting? And it really made me think about what that means from a business, finance, and operational perspective. And where I landed was that I don't want to be Pollyanna about the real challenges that are out there. But I think for me, leading with optimism was not just identifying the issues, but also acquiring the knowledge or the resource, tools, or people to address them. I think there's a lot of optimism in that. It doesn't negate the real issues that we have to deal with, but you and I agree, managing the status quo to what end, retreating, or throwing your hands up and feeling helpless, that doesn't feel like leadership. It doesn't sound like leadership. So you really have to think about, so what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Those problems are real, but what are you going to do? And I think that's where we're trying to do at NBOA.
And that's what what I like about what you're saying is, to me, you just made a distinction between the difference between good optimism and bad optimism. Bad optimism is fundamentally a view about something that doesn't lead to any action, that doesn't lead to any change, doesn't lead to being resolute, right? If the orientation is we're going to promote what's possible, that we're going to open possibilities for people, that creates a mood of, you know what? Here's the actions we can take to move this forward. So ultimately, what we're attempting to do is get people to a place where they see that something's possible. And in our culture we call that optimism, but I think a lot of optimism doesn't lead to the kind of action that's necessary. And that's the shift, right? We don't just want people feeling good. I've led more workshops and keynote addresses where I can get people to feel good for 10 minutes. And then they go back and fall back into their old. So the question that has more to do with, from my point of view, is how do we get them to actually sustain that kind of positivity and have it affect others to then take the action they need to take? And that's what we're fighting against all the time, because we can so easily fall back into those moods of skepticism.
But what's interesting, especially as we're on the eve of the NBOA annual meeting, that first of all, those types of connections among people who have shared challenges and perhaps can share solutions does create a feeling of optimism. But what I always try and highlight is this national brain trust. Think about the acquisitions that get made or can be made when you have all of these people in a room, in a community that's very collegial and is so collaborative. And so for me, the optimism is understanding the challenge, but acquiring that knowledge, taking that next step. What do I need to know? Whether it's through data, whether it's through people, or whether it's identifying a solution, a school that you're aware of that changed to an index tuition model, and it changed the future trajectory of their school. I mean, that's what I think leading with optimism is.
And the national brain trust you talked about, as you just described that, what that provoked for me is that the work is ultimately about mobilizing our small communities and larger communities to begin to take action, and then others begin to see not only that it's safe, but that actually we can produce this change. And I know that's where you come from. That's who you've been ever since I met you, and you still have that energy, and you're still smiling. It's amazing. You have not been beaten down yet.
You know what? I feel very fortunate. I don't want to get all, syrupy on you, but I mean, I love education. I always have. I love being associated with this community. I think you do too, whether it's higher ed or pre-K through 12. I mean, talk about touching something that feels positive, that feels like it's giving back and it's making a difference, right? I mean, I don't know if there's anything else that I could possibly feel that way about other than education. I work with a fantastic membership of smart, good people. I've said that since day one. I feel very fortunate about that. But I have to say, the high, why I'm still smiling after all this time, the high when you see all these people together in one space. And I don't know if they can even observe it. I get to step, I take one step back from it, and I have that opportunity. But to see that energy and the feelings, and how that all happens, I was in this profession long enough to know where they said face-to-face meetings were going to go away, where we thought webinars and online learning and all of that, and 9/11, no one was going to get on a plane anymore and go to face-to-face meetings. And boy, did some prognosticators call that one wrong, because I think
they did.
Face-to-face meetings have drawn out people even more because of the ubiquity of online learning, like we're doing right now through this podcast, which I think is great. But it augmented learning. It didn't displace it. It opened up the channels, right, and the different opportunities, but it didn't displace that face-to-face connection. Anyway, I'm on a soapbox, but that excites me, and it's a high.
You're right. I think the face-to-face is an antidote to something that we're all suffering from, which is the way that we have lost sort of the capacity to be in conversation because of texting and email and all that. So it makes perfect sense to me, Jeff, that people are starving for this kind of connection. And you have an industry where you would have thought that it would go away, but you still have to be offering something in the end that's building on that, which I think you guys do.
I think they embrace it because they know how special it is. They know it's only increased in value because it's so special, that human connection. It's so special, that eye-to-eye contact that you now have in face-to-face meetings. So I think the value has actually gone up. But you're right.
And you're very smart, because when you step outside your door right now, you have to put on a decent heavy coat. You're very smart about where you pick these. Where are you doing this thing? This is San Diego? Very nice.
We're doing a tour of the South. Yes, we're going to be in San Diego, and then we're going to Orlando next year. So we're taking a tour of the South. But as I've told my staff, there's a number of more than a number, outstanding pre-K through 12 independent schools in the North, and we're going to have to go back north eventually, and so you'll see us take a northern tour after Orlando. So,
well, hopefully in October of next year I can come with you. I couldn't even come to this one because my son just turned 21, and we're celebrating his birthday with his older brother in Chicago. Because you remember when my kids were born. It's crazy. We've known each other that long. So we're going to Chicago.
That's a milestone.
It's a huge milestone.
I have my milestone coming up. So I decided to put my daughter's bat mitzvah right in front of the NBOA annual meeting, because I wanted to have all that fun in one weekend, right? I wanted to cram it all in to make it the most memorable weekend of my life, and I know it will be.
We are going to make available on our website not only this, but links to what you guys are doing, a link to your so an overview of this business intelligence tool that your members have access to, and I got to tell you, it's what I'm always inspired by you, Jeff, is that you always bring the kind of energy that people like being around. So I know your program is going to be fantastic.
Can I make one more point about the business intelligence piece, though, that I think is really important?
Absolutely.
Other than just building this platform, we've invested a lot of time and energy into providing resources around these reporting tools. So don't just run the financial dashboard report. Take a look at the reference guide that we've built around it. Take a look at the tutorials. Beautiful. And you'll hear from seasoned business officers about how to use this effectively at your school, why this matters, what potential responses there are to certain trends that you'd be observing. And I think, as you know, and Howard, it probably has come out of your mouth, context is so important, right? Context is everything. And so we're trying to, and we're just in the beginning, but we're trying to create context around these tools so that they are real for business officers, and so that they can access their own leadership and have the impact that we desire for these tools and resources to have at their schools.
It's a very important tool to start to mobilize the kind of conversations that leaders want to have and they don't know how to have. So I highly encourage people to check this out on our site. You can just click on it and then and go right to NBOA. Jeff, privilege again to be with you. Virtual hug. Have a great conference, and we will and great bat mitzvah. Mazel tov, the whole Megillah.
All of that. Can I just pay you one compliment? Honestly, sure. Is that you have such a unique knack of I find you to be so smart and so provide such great insight. And not only that, you bring it out in others. And I really appreciate that about our conversations. You possess it yourself, but you bring it out in others. And I think that's why you're so good at this. So I'm gonna leave you with that.
That's very nice. Thank you very much, Jeff. So have a great conference, and we will absolutely stay in touch. And thank you for joining us on this week's program.
Thanks, everybody, for downloading and listening to the show. Head over to TeibelInc.com to learn more about our work in education. You can subscribe to the show for free. Just click the blue button, and we'll send you an email each time a new episode is released. If you like what you heard today, please share with a friend or colleague who you think might appreciate a new podcast in their own library. And you can always leave us a kind review in Apple Podcasts or iTunes. Thank you so much. On behalf of Howard Teibel, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll catch you next time right here on Navigating Change, the podcast from Teibel Education.